the tweet. And what I like to do is give people a couple of minutes till we get like 100 people in here.
Gotcha.
So just, I like that. What is that behind you? It's like a,
it's a cheap reproduction of an old French like Art Deco poster.
Oh, that reminds me. I have in my bedroom. I have what's his name? The Pre-Raphaelites. The Lady Lilith.
I'm drawing a blank. I know who you mean though.
Rossetti.
Rossetti. Yeah, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Yeah.
It looks a little like the Rossetti.
Gotcha.
I'm sure it's probably inspired by it.
Gotcha. To an
extent.
I hate looking at my. 1 sec. I hate looking at myself. Is there any way I can reconfigure this so I'm not like
just
staring
turn
at my
up.
face?
Don't look at. Open up a Word doc. You don't have to look at the YouTube.
Oh, smart. You're a very clever man. You seem to know a lot about computers.
For a boomer.
We're both boomers. When were you born, man? You're. I think we're about the same age.
76.
76. So you're a kid. You're actually 3 years younger than me.
Prime time boomer.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, we got 160 people here.
160. That's not too bad.
For those who don't know who you are, get out. your kind is not welcome here. Read my book. This is not 101 pleb shit. We're not interested in what you're saying or your thoughts on anything. Don't tell us. You go tweet us about how faux news is really not part of the corporate press and blah, blah, blah. And what about Trump? Great. Not about it here today. So Mencius Moldbug you might be the creator of the new right. You're the creator of the concept of the red pill as it is popularly used and has been grossly appropriated by me. I'm raising your Asian child as my own for cultural, for social credit. We'll get to that in a second.
Basically, once I stole that meme from the Wachowskis, everybody else realized they could steal it too. And so,
if this is anyone except Steve Allen, you're stealing my bit.
Exactly.
And your series of very long pieces on unqualified reservations really set the tone for an unorthodox vision of being right-wing as opposed to the traditional and decades-long, I'd say, version. Who would you say who is right of center their views are most different from yours?
Right of center, you mean all the way to the right or near right? Or I mean, that's a huge...
okay, if someone likes you, right? Who right of center would you say they're most likely to find that person's books to be a waste of time?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'd have to say, honestly, although... well, first of all, basically, let me give you the obvious answer, which is basically anything published by kind of the lowbrow right-wing press today. Sure, I hate to say, it's like there's this brand, Regnery, which is named after the original Regnery, and I think William Regnery, who wrote Memoirs of a Dissident Publisher. And if you ever want to go find like links to weird old good books to read that book, because it's got like 100 basically book links in it. All shit that he published, and his taste was impeccable. And once the people with pre-war education started to die out, you had this kind of just loss of talent really in the right. And so the people, there were still, Buckley and the crowd around him were always very, very talented. But when all the people with pre-war educations died off, it was really a tragedy. And so, let me take issue with your question in a way, because when you say in the right, I really struggle with this.
Your question is wrong.
Your question, no, I'm sorry. Your question, actually, Michael, your question is completely wrong, because the problem is that there's actually, you may be unaware of this, but there's actually no such thing as the right per se, because right is just the absence of left. And so leftism is a sort of very distinct thing. It's a very clear tradition. Everything outside that tradition, from within that tradition, gets labeled as, quote, right. And so, a good example of this is, do you by any chance happen to be a Gentile? Are you a Gentile?
Come on, what do you think?
Are you now, or ever have been a Gentile?
I've been circumcised twice.
There's one place. Let me tell you. There's one place. There's one place in this great country where you can be a Gentile. Do you know where it is?
Where?
Utah. I'm not kidding. Doesn't everyone know this joke? Like, a Jew can fly to Utah and be a Gentile because oh yeah, right. So you knew that, right? So so the word Gentile is like the word right in that it's a negative classification. It's like, imagine if you live in Carthage and you believe in Baal, right? So, you say, okay, it's not that you believe in Baal, you understand Baal. Yeah, it's like metal hair, basically. It's COVID hair, but it's very Zeppelin. Not intentional. Michael also has amazing hair, and you've had it done, which I think is illegal. In any case, when you're a Gentile in Utah, you're part of a negative set. Your set is defined by not being Mormon. So when you're basically right wing, your set is defined by not being left. It's like, to get back to Carthage before this fool, said something about my hair. To get back to Carthage, to get back to Carthage, let's get back to Carthage. Let's say you're living in Carthage and you believe in Baal, but it's not that you believe in Baal. It's that you recognize the truth of Baal. You understand Baal. So, okay, everybody who's cool understands Baal. And then outside, somewhere like you go to Italy or something, you find people that have even heard of fucking Baal, right? Or they hate Baal. Mostly they hate Baal. So what are these people called? They're called anti-Baalists, right? So if you're a Jew, you're an anti-Baalist. Of course, Bible says a lot about Baal. Not very good things. If you're a Buddhist, you're an anti-Baalist. And so the thing is, when you're looking for sort of members of this very, very disparate set, historically, you're basically saying, everything but left, in a sense, if that makes sense. And so, I just want to take issue with that classification of the set. But if you want me to narrow down on, sort of other right-wing stuff, I don't like. That's, again, for me, a little bit too much of a negative set because my tastes are very specific. And so it's like Evola. Someone was asking me about Evola the other day. I've read Evola. His style is not really mine. He's got interesting things to say, but he's very much in this kind of continental hermetic tradition,
yes. Which, this
kind of fortune cookie Kantbot style stuff, and Kantbot and I, of course, I was on his show not too long ago, but we really have this very major creative difference over the continental versus the Anglo tradition. So I'm really an Anglo guy, and I'm very into finding old Anglo references that people have never heard of before.
Well, here's someone that you'll like. I'm 10 pages away from finishing Eugene Lyon's book, The Red Decade, which I heard you recently recommended.
That is a fabulous book, and moreover, his book on I'm blanking on the title right now. His book that he wrote, which was his autobiography of being in Russia, is even more amazing. What's Assignment in Utopia? Yes. I read that one recently. I found it in all places. I found a used copy of that book in the only used bookstore in West Maui. Somehow it had made its way there, and it was all I had to read in basically Hawaii, and it was fucking amazing. It's really, it's up there with Muggeridge if you've read Muggeridge.
Does it bother you how much contemporary conservatives are of the belief that the culture and the left has gotten more extreme, as they would say, or more in control of culture?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that it's ever not been in control of culture throughout our lives. And this is the point. The thing is that, conservatives, mainstream conservatives, DC conservatives have a very sort of, if you go back before Buckley, their history is completely made out of cardboard. And so the fact that, what you realize when you read The Red Decade, and Eugene Lyons, for those who don't know, was he had this kind of classic Jewish communist background. He was actually a member of the Communist Party, and he lost his faith. He got himself assigned as the UPI reporter to in Moscow, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of as if like, somehow Nazis had gotten like the Huffington Post alt-right columnist to actually be a secret Nazi, right? Not quite like that, but that's that's as surprising as that would have been to most Americans. And so basically he's sent there to sort of deliver these tongue baths to the regime, and he gets disillusioned, and he comes back to America and basically decides for whatever stupid reason to tell the truth. I think he was working and writing up into the 50s. Of course, he could never have any kind of mainstream publication again after that. What you realize when you read the Red Decade is that essentially, everyone who is cool is a Bolshevik.
Yeah, not just left, like literally a like Stalinist.
Like literally someone. I mean, it's like when you look at like what Lindbergh like collaborates with Hitler, right? What does it mean? It means he flies over there and towards some factries and he gets a fucking
medal.
piece of. He gets a medal, right? And if you look at if you let's say there's a method of history called prosopography, which means basically the drawing of connections, essentially the drawing of a social graph. And when you basically draw the social graph between like, rich, wealthy, powerful people in the Eastern Seaboard and Nazi Germany, it's like this like little dotted line, that like looks like it was drawn by a child. And if you draw the same social graph from that to Moscow at the time when Moscow's atrocities are 3 orders of magnitude, at least worse than Hitler's, it looks like a giant fucking bicep going out over the North Pole. It's like, everything about Moscow was cool. And so all cool people were into this. And, to be into this, I mean, to be a red, I guess is the best way to describe it, because most people sort of, when you say someone's a communist, they're like, okay, can I see his membership card? Has the card expired? Is he still paying his dues? Right. So, I'm sort of beginning to like this term red because, it's so general and so clear. And my own grandparents were Reds, very much the stripe. They had a very similar background to Eugene Lyons. They were Brooklyn Jews. They were in the party from the 20s through the 70s, right? So lifers, right? So and for them, it was just this huge source of social climbing. These were like garment industry, hardworking garment industry people, and their best friends are like these like Italian film distributors. How is my grandfather in the garment industry best friends with someone who distributes Italian films in fucking New York, right? And so the answer is essentially that when you look at what it means to be red, what it actually means is it's sort of always been, at least for the last century or so, the ideology of America's fashionable aristocracy. Yes. And so that is associated with these various causes, the workers, the this, the that, there's the class stuff, the race stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then people look at this now, if you listen to some fashionable, red podcast, they'll talk about the professional, the PMC, which to me means mercenary actually, but and like, this PMC is just America's fashionable aristocracy. It's what it always, has been. You can trace it back to like the 500 families of like 1900. These are all the same people. And so, basically when you try to say, okay, in the 1930s, or like FDR was some kind of like conservative hero or something, FDR was a socialite, he had he was a lot like Trump in some ways, except they had actual class. But he had a lot of the same skills as Trump, and he was not a striver. He was from the top. And these are always the people who've ruled this country. And so at least going back to, if you want to trace it back historically, I would say it kind of starts with the mugwumps or liberal Republicans of the 1890s. So you look at like John Hay or Henry Adams, and that's sort of where this governing tradition in America begins. But it sort of just becomes, it's almost like, it's just animated by power. It's like these people in the early 20th century see that there's this kind of power vacuum because these politicians are very, very weak. And so you get this kind of ideology of like democracy is something that like transcends politics. That's basically the birth of oligarchy in America.
But what else conservatives don't remember, even though conservatism, we're told, takes the lessons of history and applies it to day-to-day life. If you look at the 1920s and 30s, it's the people from the New Yorker The same fucking publication that's around here. It's Dorothy Parker. It's James Thurber of the famed Algonquin Roundtable sitting down and signing a letter that says that those trials that Stalin was putting on were men who were confessing to having met Trotsky to undermine the Soviet Union in airports that did not exist because they had been tortured and their families were killed. I know. And the audience doesn't know. I'm just saying. They don't realize that this has been going on for 100 years. This isn't just happening now because of Caitlyn Jenner.
Yeah, exactly. And it's totally not. But the thing is, it changes over time. I mean, the way that's an excellent way to tell it. The way I usually tell it is, I say, well, you know, what's the most accurate historical movie that you know, you've ever seen?
The Matrix.
And, The Matrix is good, but have you seen Reds with Warren Beatty?
I have not. I know she got an Oscar for playing Emma Goldman, the supporting actress, Jean Stapleton. Yeah.
Well, Reds with Warren Beatty is playing John Reed. You might have heard of John Reed. He's the only American buried in the wall of the Kremlin. You probably didn't know there was an American buried in the wall of the Kremlin, but there is, and it's John Reed, and it was for very good reasons. And not only did John Reed fuck Russia, actually right before he fucked Russia, he went to Mexico and played a fairly considerable part in the Mexican Revolution. Okay, that may be an exaggeration. He was there. I mean, America played sort of by projecting this ideology, played a very significant part. You know, but he's basically this like plague rat of revolution. And, you know, who is this plague rat of revolution? He's basically this child of privilege and graduate of the famed Harvard class of 1912. And he's friends with Lakeland Steffens, Walter Lippmann, and basically all the fucking cool people, right? And so in a way, what you have is this kind of sort of deranged arson colonialism, you know, where these guys are basically going to foreign countries that have cultures that they don't like and rulers that they don't like and fucking torching them. And so, you know, in a way, I'm like, okay, let's, you know, you want to talk about white guilt. I mean, you know, that's basically what was going on there, and that was really a very active project of the, you know, of the American upper crust. You know, I was reading. There's this memoir. Gosh, I'm blanking on the name. It's by one of the founders of Slavic Studies in America. It's called The Russia I Believe In. It was actually put together posthumously by the guy's brother after he died suddenly out of like letters and shit. For that reason, it's considerably too honest. So this guy was basically a talented young linguist in, you know, the Chicago area. He got sponsored by the Rockefellers. He got sponsored by this very influential arson tourist named Charles R. Crane, who also helped to burn down China and the Middle East. And also, if you've ever seen the name Crane in like the toilet, same Crane. So basically, this guy is like sponsored by the Rockefellers to be essentially. You ever heard the term Sandinista?
No.
The people who went down to Nicaragua in the 80s because of the revolution. Okay. You know Birkenstock wearers, basically.
Yeah, of course,
Right. So this guy, well, I mean, this is a much upscale version of this. This guy is basically paid to go to Tsarist Russia and basically find, you know, aspiring professional revolutionaries and fund them. Right. Yeah. So imagine you're like some cool dude, like, you know, imagine like Putin is like doing this with like the US alt-right. Right. You know, so you're this is a ridiculous analogy, of course, but, you know, Putin sends over this guy with like $10 million effectively in a briefcase. And who does he want to have dinner with? Right. You know, and so obviously when you're doing this, you're the most popular person in town. You're the most fashionable thing in the world. I mean, you see how these protests have gotten copied around the world in this just bizarre way. So you're essentially in this position where all of America, all of American high society is basically trying to destroy these countries as it exists. And this guy is telling a story. I forget if it's him or a friend of his who's raising money for like the friends of Russia, which of course means the enemies of Russia. And they're like, you know, recruiting, they're like going to like rich old Jewish ladies and raising money. And one of them is like, here's my $50. Here's a check. I hope this buys the bomb that kills the czar.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, it's very like raising for Al Qaeda and like, Saudi Arabia today, they sort of wink at it because there was no regime less popular than that of Russia in America in 1900 among all classes. Right. So, it's just basically like if you go into the real history, you just very quickly get to the point where you can't handle the truth. And it's not for sort of stupid conspiracy theory reasons. It's for reasons that are kind of too complicated to even be viral as conspiracy theories. So it's just opaque.
Let's get to some of the questions, but one question I had quick is, one thing I'm seeing are enormous parallels in the 1920s and 30s between this idea of, you know what, maybe Russia will work, let's let it try it out over there, and this contemporary idea of defund the police, where I think a lot of people are thinking, you know what, this is crazy, but it's in their neighborhoods, so maybe this is a good idea. I think it's the same kind of mentality, don't you?
You've probably heard the phrase or read the phrase, the Soviet experiment.
Yeah, of course, yes.
You'll see that. Sorry, got a text. You'll see that in just about everything that's written that way. And of course, these experiments, I mean, before the Soviet experiment, we had the French experiment. Imagine if revolution was a drug and you were asking the FDA to approve it. You'd be like, well, we tested it on France. We saw some good results. There was a little bit of toxicity. Let's give it another shot, right?
Minor, yeah. Minor
the operation overall was a success. These were peaceful protests. We've stopped the U.S. Army outside, right. So, I mean, sorry, we're get me back to your question.
I've seen the parallels between Russia's great experiment. Who cares about them over there with the inner cities today and the
the thing is that this notion of experiments is like, if it's scientism. I mean, if you're proceeding in an actually scientific way and you're saying, okay, well, we're going to let, Russia go crazy, but China is going to get to keep its emperor. Nobody's actually doing that. And also nobody's actually listening to the results. The extent to which it's an experiment, I mean, what you'll find is that when these experiments fail, there are always sort of very specific excuses. One thing, for example, that most people don't know about decolonialization is that before decolonialization, the rhetoric of decolonialization was always that the colonial powers were actually retarding the economic development of these countries by restricting them to light industry and farming and so forth. And what they really needed was, if they could rule themselves, they would choose rapid development with steel mills in the jungle, right? People really believed this. And then after this was tried, they realized that actually the cause of all the problems was that the colonialists had set up borders that didn't correspond to the natural structures of tribes, which is apparently very important, except when it's not. It's basically, you can always sort of pull an excuse, out of everywhere for, the sort of the objective results of your policies. I remember when, people were, when I was at Johns Hopkins in 1988, people were building shanty towns to protest the U.S. Support for the regime in South Africa. Support meant not trying to destroy it fast enough.
Right,
but they eventually managed to destroy it. And, the question of whether this has produced better government in South Africa, which was obviously the intent of the policy, is perhaps arguable. So you see this sort of like, this kind of scientific mindset, or this mindset of sort of proceeding as if rational public policy was going on all over the place. And you see it in COVID, where basically you went from just the flu, don't be a racist, in the course of a week when Trump screwed the pooch, and of course, and sort of it somehow magically senses this opening that the truth is unoccupied and can be grasped. If Trump had been like, let's kill the virus at all costs from day one, they would have been, it's just the flu, and they would have stayed with just the flu, right? And they would have had no opportunity, like the truth would have been basically blocked off from them. But, when the truth was unoccupied, zoom, right? They rush into it. And then sort of when they sense, and again, this is sort of an organic effect. It's a gestalt. There's no conspiracy. There's no central point. But, suddenly the opportunity that comes to have this amazing George Floyd movement, this huge, sort of fundraising thing, if nothing else, and certainly objectively true that a lot of money has been raised here. Then they just leap straight to have a blast, like social change is more important. So in a way, it's like you see reason sort of like being dragged around by, I forget who made this analogy. It wasn't me, but it's like, seeing some sort of alien beast like slither into the face of your mother. Like the things that they're doing are just becoming weirder and weirder.
Yeah.
and no one seems to really have control of that. It's this sort of relatively rapid spiral where sort of people get out weirded until just really strange things are happening. I think that a lot of my friends, a lot of people I know are sort of very depressed by these very strange things that are happening. I tend to be more optimistic.
Yeah, I'm ecstatic.
Yeah, ecstatic.
I'm ecstatic.
That's pretty strong. This is wonderful. I love the accent there. This is my grandfather's accent. This is wonderful.
I have an accent?
No, you used an accent. It slipped out of you. It slipped out of you.
Did it? It's from my native. Last question before we get to the audience questions. How did it make you feel, or I don't know if you heard about this, to know that Greg Gutfeld referred to the cathedral by name on Fox News? Exasperated sigh.
Yeah, it's always worrisome to see to go downscale, basically. Quite frankly, I think there's a sort of desperation in kind of wanting to reach a larger audience, with your ideas. I mean, as a grifter, I'm for it, but I only just started grifting. By the way, while I'm grifting, I should mention my new Substack, which you can subscribe to.
Yeah, email me all the links, so I'll put them in the comments so people can find the subject. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll tell you. Should I email you before the show's over, or I can email you right now?
You can.
Okay. Hang on, let me just email you this right now as I talk. I'm kind of you're going to use both hemispheres of my brain today. So the Substack is called Gray Mirror, and it's at Gray Mirror. That's gray with an A. Substack.com, and what I'm doing is basically serializing a book in a very 19th century style fashion. It's like Dickens or something, and instead of paying 3 pence a month, you pay $10 a month, which I think is not too much for a fine book of this sort. The content of the book is essentially. Oh, you got a problem?
No, I'm gonna put it on the screen for everybody.
Oh, excellent. Well, I'll keep talking.
Keep talking.
Yes. Graymirror.substack.com. And so basically you get access to the chapters of my book, which is called Gray Mirror of the Nihilist Prince. It is not a YA novel. It's in a way the sort of the aggressive style comes from my friend Bap.
Bronze Age pervert.
I love that guy. And in any case, one of the things that I sort of tended to talk a little bit less about in UR is what could happen or be done in the future. I think it's sort of more appropriate to talk about that now. The form that I've chosen to write this in is actually a medieval form, which is called A Mirror for Princes. Which explains most of the YA tier name. A Mirror for Princes is exactly sort of what it sounds like. It's basically a manual, an operating manual for a state that is written for a prince, a presumably absolute prince, inheriting the government of that state. It's not, Machiavelli's work of that name is sort of a little bit like that. Machiavelli also talks about how to actually get and keep power. This is not something that the normal medieval mirrors for princes do, but it's obviously something that any such book written today will have to do. So that's going to also be part of the book, but that's a later part of the book. But yeah, you can subscribe to that. I'm going to read the chapters out as podcasts and post them on the Substack platform. You can also just subscribe to all the free posts on Substack, but at some point they will just not include the juicy stuff. So, you can be in or be out. It's up to you, but I very much appreciate a subscription. Thank you, Justin.
I'll leave that up. And let me ask, there's a ton of questions that I'm catching up on, so let's get them to them.
Okay.
What books on progressivism would you recommend?
Ooh,
that's a good one.
That's a pretty good, that's a difficult topic in some ways. I think one of the earliest books I read is a book called Authoritarian Socialism in America. It's a book on the very early and obscure kind of versions of this, really, almost pre or non-Marxist. So, it talks about Bellamy, it talks about Ignatius Donnelly's Caesar's Column, all kinds of strange, good stuff. I think it sort of never hurts to go back as deeply as possible. In a way, that question depends on what you feel you already know. But in general, I would sort of err on the side of finding earlier works. Memoirs of people who've basically left the movement are good. This is more, earlier communism than progressivism. Max Eastman's memoir, Enjoyment of Living, is quite good. I think
wasn't he the one who wrote the essay, What Did You Know and When Did You Know It? No, it wasn't him, but basically
he may have coined the phrase. There's a wonderful book by Bella Dodd, who was a school teacher in New York, who was on the American Politburo and got kicked off after the Duclos letter, called School of Darkness. The wonderful thing about School of Darkness is, it's a horrible book, of course, but it's well written and very truthfully and plainly told, which I really like. Bella Dodd, when she's kicked off the Politburo for being a Browderite, is subjected to a show trial for being a racist. Literally, she's accused of being mean to her, Puerto Rican building super for reasons of racial chauvinism. And so in a way, I'm like, if you want to find the origins of things, like, now, the racial show trial is a thing of everyday life for everybody in this country. But if you go back, basically 70 years, where do you find it? You have to go to the inside. And there indeed you find it. And they did that. So that's a good book. If you want to move, later into the 60s and the New Left, there's a book called Dreams Die Hard by David Harris. He was a Stanford war resistor. He was at one time married to Joan Baez. A lot of people were married to Joan Baez, not at the same time. And so that's a good, in a way, the New Left is the movement that's in charge of us today. I mean, they used to call it, of course, the movement, if you know this. And, there's sort of nothing else that's left. Everything since 1968 is essentially the same stuff. Particularly for anyone who wants to write a history paper in recent history, it would be an interesting marker to trace the attempts to introduce the black with a capital B into American orthography. Because we're entering a kind of a new phase of that. But I think that it sort of feels 70s to me, but I think you saw some attempts at that in the 60s. I think that's, hopefully a decent list of interesting sources.
What country in the world has the most freedom today?
Oh, gosh. Wow, these are really hard questions, man.
I told you we're going to have good people. I weed out the dopes.
The most freedom today. That term means so many different things in so many different ways.
Just say Israel.
All right, Israel. Certainly, I have a friend who's a settler in the West Bank, actually, if you're listening, hi Baruch, I owe you an email, if you hear him describe the way he lives, which is this very wild West way in kind of a sort of a beautiful sense. Yeah, I mean, he's in no man's land. He's actually in legally unclaimed territory. So, I mean, that's sort of one aspect of freedom. I mean, there's sort of so many different aspects of that question. But just to troll, I'll say definitely Israel.
How do we bring on the coming monarchy? That was another question that I missed.
Well, very simple. Your first step is to subscribe to my Substack.
That's actually a correct answer. That is the correct answer.
Unfortunately, yeah. What can I say? Yeah. I mean, the thing is that you don't. I'm a very strong believer in political disengagement. What I call detachment. If you read my first chapter, it's basically all about that. If you want a simple process of that, imagine feeling about the government as if you were an American expat who'd retired to Costa Rica. How do you feel about the Costa Rican government? Right. Do you obey its speed limits? Absolutely. Do you break its laws? You really try not to. Do you care about its politics? Do you vote? Well, you might want to sort of predict its politics. If they're turning bad, maybe you want to get out of the country. The idea of like being involved in giving consent in some sense to the government is like just irrelevant to you, right? And so, once you do that, you're sort of both very at peace with what happens, and you're sort of very objective about predicting its actions and responding to its actions. So, for example, if you're living in Costa Rica in this sense, you're like, okay, well, is something a bad thing to do? Well, it could be illegal, but nobody enforces the law, so everybody does it, so I'll just do it. It could be legal, but in fact, I'll get fucked over by some power group if I do it, so I won't do it. And you're essentially you're sort of becoming a legal objectivist through this attitude, because you basically realize that law is not what's written in the books, but what's actually enforced. Yeah. And so you're getting good practice in living in a third world country, which I don't know. I don't have to say it. Yeah. But
can the free market oust the radical activists who are the ideological offspring of the cathedral from positions of cultural and political power?
Do you want a simple answer or a complicated answer? Let's start with a simple answer.
You can't give a simple answer. Why?
Yeah, this time I have a simple answer, and you know what it is. It's no, and it's simply no. If you want the reason why it's no, it's one way to let's think about it. This answer has a lot of complicated resonances in a lot of places, but just for a very concrete example, think about journalism. Let's go even closer and think just about tech journalism. In tech journalism, there's basically two kinds of journalism that you can write. There's journalism, the old-fashioned style of basically trade magazine journalism, which is like, let's leak this new feature of the new AMD chip before anyone else, or here's this beautiful Oculus Rift or whatever, which is can be done at a high kind of literary level and a high level of quality, but you still basically it's not it doesn't feel like ennobling work to the person who writes it. And it also doesn't feel, you don't have the sense of themos of like importance and power when you read it. So about 5 or 10 years ago, this was replaced by a new breed of tech journalism, which is basically attack tech journalism, where they're essentially like, let's rip Facebook a new asshole. Yeah. And, the thing is, once you're like, let's rip Facebook a new asshole, you don't really care that much about the facts of what you're doing. It feels tremendously good, which means you can be paid less because you're being paid in power and status. You're mattering in a very, very different way now. So you get better writers for less money. Your shit is more entertaining. Not only is your shit kind of more entertaining because the writers are better, but the reader is feeling it. Basically, once you read a story like that, you're essentially already part of a mob that's basically about to break down the windows and pull down the statues of Facebook, right? Yeah, and so, you're basically feeling this fire of revolution, in your body. So basically, it's like the difference between a very, nutritious product and a product sweetened with like sugar and cocaine, right? And maybe a little bit of fentanyl and meth, right? There's just no way in the market, and it comes with porn, right? And there's essentially no in the free market which of these things is going to win, right? It's pretty obvious, and that's why the answer is no.
Okay, fair. Are people like Jimmy Dore being unplugged or reinforced?
I'm really ashamed to say I have no idea who Jimmy Dore is.
I think they mean red-pilled leftists.
Red-pilled leftists. That's such a complicated question of sort of what that means. It's like, baked Alaska or military intelligence or something.
I would
think
define a red pill leftist as a leftist who perceives the nature and agenda of the corporate press.
Okay, that's fair. Or the people who talk about the PMC, and yeah, those people certainly exist. What tends to happen historically with people whenever you have an influential faction that splits off from the left. And what's the last influential faction that splits off from the left that you can think of? Starts with a T.
What, the trans stuff?
Trotskyists.
Oh, Trotskyists. Okay.
Right. So, and
the
who
National
did the
Review.
Right. And who did the Trotskyists turn into? They turned into the neocons, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, not only, to say they turned into conservatives is a little bit wrong. What happened is they expanded into the conservative space and outcompeted all of the original conservatives, right? Because they basically because they were still leftists, they're basically like, these are like people who are like, I think, there's a number of different approaches to treating alcoholism, right? Most of them involve complete abstinence. But there are some people who basically believe in moderate consumption. And so these are kind of the people who believe in moderate consumption of leftism in a way. The problem that these people always find is that they get themselves excommunicated. Once they get themselves excommunicated, there's sort of a pro and a con. The con is they've been excommunicated and they've lost these mainstream markets. The pro is they have higher status than any of the fucking redneck conservatives out there. And so they realize that they can use the status to actually take over and own the conservative movement and become its stars. And so that's, or they just, don't realize that and dwindle into obscurity. But, maybe there's enough of them to do that. I don't know.
Are you familiar with Tom Nichols?
Not at all.
Okay, good. That's to your credit. Okay, though current events are a blip on the radar, do you see America going toward a more authoritarian or more libertarian direction?
These words they're not really words that I like to use because they're, authoritarian is essentially a sort of strange pejorative because sovereignty is conserved. All states have complete authority, whether you see it or not. It's just a question of sort of how coherently and efficiently they can use that authority, and do use that authority that gives you the sense of authoritarian. I don't think actually, there's certainly the senses in which we see power active today are mostly not acting through the government. If anything, they're sort of acting because formal power sort of becomes passive in the face of informal, efforts. But what you see is that, informal power is very firmly in the saddle and has been for quite some time. If you're talking about the extension of that informal power into sort of increasingly intrusive, interventions in our kind of personal and professional lives, absolutely. I do see an increase in that, but that's not, I think, what most people mean when they say authoritarian.
Well, someone's really happy to have us both in here. Are you an inflationista or a deflationista?
Well, that's a complicated question. I would say that I'm a deflationista. But the thing is, there's a sort of a fire and ice issue because the issue is between slow inflation or semi-catastrophic, not possibly catastrophic, but sort of restrained by central bank intervention deflation. So the real question is basically, does the Fed manage to keep reflating the financial markets, or do you enter more Japanese conditions? Which would be basically deflationary conditions, which would go very well. There's sort of there's a sort of yawning inconsistency between zero interest rates and a world that's not deflating, because zero interest rates mean that it's basically very hard to lend. The amount of supply of money is much greater than the demand for money. That indicates sort of an economy where you're kind of pushing on a rope, lending into it. And I think sooner or later that rope will just go slack and it'll be very hard to get money into the economy, except with increasingly strange fiscal measures, which sort of might happen, but might not happen for political reasons. Japan has managed to sort of keep going with this kind of economics, but you know, not in a way that inflates its asset prices. So that's what matters most.
To what extent do you think this scenario is specific to the U.S. due to its unique upbringing? This is in Portuguese.
Which scenario exactly?
I don't know what he was referring to. I think he means just the thing with the Red Decade. Perhaps.
In Brazil, you know, eu falo pouco de de português.
Is that Ebonics?
That's a, you know, that's actually, it's Portuguese, but it sounds like Ebonics because not only am I saying it, but you know, it's actually, I learned a little bit of mainland Portuguese, which is not Brazilian Portuguese, and it basically sounds like a cross between Ebonics and like Czech. It doesn't even sound like a Romance language, you know. And in any case, that's all my Portuguese, but you know, muito obrigado. And so
the fuck did you call me?
Exactly. So in any case, to try to answer the question about, you know, the 30s in Brazil, you know, of course, you know, my familiarity with Brazilian, you know, history is not great, but I will say that Brazil has the world's coolest flag because on the flag it says "Ordem Progresso," which means "fuck your." It means order and progress, order and progress. And this comes from this sort of native Brazilian tradition called, you know, integralism, which is not the same as the sort of fashionable preppy tradcath integralism, but it kind of is the same in some ways in that it's basically fascist. And they wear blue shirts, I believe. I think the president, the maximum leader you're looking for is Getulio Vargas. I could be wrong. And in any case, you had this very sort of development-oriented fascism. Of course, there's a lot of Germans there. They got super fascist at that time. You know, but of course you have in, you know, in the sort of the Brazilian sense, I had a boss who was Brazilian. Actually, he was Brazilian Chinese about 20 years ago. And, you know, this was just as I was sort of realizing, you know, some strange things about the world. And my boss comes to me and he's like, you know, tell me something. I'm really confused because, you know, my brother-in-law owns a video store. And he's a totally middle-class person. And he's totally like pro-Bush and pro-American. And my sister is a documentary filmmaker. And she's like completely integrated. She's completely Americanized. She's completely integrated with the American world. And she's extremely anti-American. And she's like, how do you explain this? And I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting question. Let me think about that. And so It's like the most Americanized parts of the world are the most anti-American. And so in a way, what you're seeing when you export anti-Americanism in this way is you're exporting sort of the hatred of a ruling class for the people it rules over. Like you have to rule a country, you have to hate it a little bit. And that's basically what's going on in Blue America to a certain amount is basically, yeah, I think they just pulled down a statue or two maybe, you know, and that's like, imagine if you're like, you know, the Goths and you sack Rome, you're like, okay, Caesar, fuck your statue. I'm going to go and piss on your statue. Right. It's this act of like, you know, it's like this extreme flex, right? You know, and so, and you're sort of supposed to be, you have this sort of ideology as to why you should be flexed on. And the reality is you're being flexed on because you're a subject and you're being ruled, and that's just all there is to it. And that's either going to change or it's not. So the thing is that I think, you know, Brazil's attempt under Bolsonaro to throw off the yokes of Yankee imperialism has not overall been a success. It's sort of, you know, like the Trump administration. It's sort of interesting to watch this, but it's like the spasm of a dying, you know, animal in the jaws of an inexorable snake, you know, and so I don't know, do better next time. But yeah, that would be. Sorry, go on.
Do you see Silicon Valley being as part of the cathedral? Is it a newer arm of it, or just an outgrowth of the universities?
That's an interesting question. There's a lot of generalizations behind it. I think that you know, the number of the set of dissidents in Silicon Valley might go as high as 5%. You know, which is a relatively high number for like a dissident population. Of course, it includes a lot of different levels of kind of dissident opinion. But you know, that's certainly exists. There are probably yeah, I mean, on the other hand, the sort of the late culture, the overwhelmingly dominant culture of the place is, of course, this very demanding and rigid progressivism. Facebook actually just did something very bold where they fired an engineer because they were basically publicly harassing another Facebook engineer on Twitter for not putting more progressive stuff in their code of conduct or something like that, or not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Facebook is like, enough, you can't be publicly harassing your coworkers.
Yeah.
Which is a very bold, step to, take. I think that on the other hand, with a lot of this, I've thought this, many people have thought this before, and I've been like, well, I'm not really sure. I think some of this latest stuff starts to get into the territory. There's this great line of Napoleon where he was like, never interrupt your enemy when he's in the process of making a mistake. I think there might be a little bit of, overreaching here. I could be wrong. I could be right. I don't know. On the other hand, everyone is like, oh, this is too much. People will never believe in this. And then 10 years later, everybody believes in it.
Oh yeah. Right.
So, yeah. It's never too wise to get your hopes up, but the level of strange is really increasing at a fairly rapid rate.
Have you read any Don Miguel Ruiz? I have not. The person
I have not either.
Okay.
Is that would be Don Miguel Ruiz or Don? Like Don, like Don Johnson or Don King? I'm going to go with Don.
In what way, this is the great one. I know your answer to this. In what ways did the Machiavellians change your thinking?
I mean, I owe so much to finding a copy of that extremely rare book, in a used bookstore in San Francisco, 15 years ago or something. Sort of showing me, I mean, it's just like, I was sort of already thinking in this kind of very rationalistic direction already, but showing that actually people had gone this way, really as far as was needed long before me. And had basically established that all these kind of religious mysteries of politics could be kind of demystified and treated in this kind of coldly, kind of clear, rational, and historical way. I mean, that's just any political science outside of that tradition is just pseudoscience as far as I'm concerned.
Did you catch Moldbug's episode in Thad Russell's podcast? I did not. Curtis, what did you think of that episode and of Thad Russell's wider work?
I thought it was a lot of fun. I don't really know Thad Russell's work that much. It's sort of very difficult for someone. The thing is, it's just, Russell is a historian. He was taught at Columbia before he was dismissed for some like absurd thing, now kind of peddles his wares on the internet, just as I'm doing. I think it's very hard for someone who's not identified as right wing to basically solve certain conceptual problems, because you have to there are certain boundaries that you have to break to kind of get to the sort of truth that really feels and smells like the real thing. And breaking those boundaries is sort of very, very hard. It has to be done, especially when those kind of factual treatments are very much part of, sort of an almost spiritual worldview. If you're really going to do it properly, you have to really speak to those people's spiritual concerns at the same time as you're like, no, your understanding of the facts was like, typed up in some Politburo meeting in 1952, right? So there's a lot of, people felt genuine sadness when Stalin died, when Kim Il-sung died. I mean, people can believe in, just about anything. Yeah. And so, to speak to those people, you have to do so with real sensitivity, which is really, really hard. And at the same time, you have to be willing to sort of transgress these factual boundaries, and those factual boundaries are also not the kind of factual boundaries that everyone expects to be transgressed, because you're not being you're not inhabiting the stereotype that they have of their enemies, which is obviously very important. So yeah, I mean, it's just, unless you're willing to go, that rogue, I think his thing is called the Renegade University or something like that. That's a bold title, obviously. And in a way, to even sort of think of yourself as a renegade or a rebel is kind of limiting, because you're still within that frame. So, but he's obviously, he's a great guy. He's very well educated. He knows his American history quite well. It was super fun talking to him.
What's the difference between your version of monarchy and anarcho-capitalism, and what news service do you follow?
The news service that I follow is basically evil Twitter. Anarcho-capitalism is a specific sort of, it's a specific policy space in a way. And the way, I would sort of, let me broaden this generally to libertarianism, because anarcho-capitalism is really a libertarian variant. One thing that's been recognized, for a very long time is, you find it in the ancient Chinese writings of like Lao Tzu, is that the best government governs the least. And the thing is, the causality there, however, is somewhat problematic. Because it's not really true that you can take a very badly governed situation and govern it less and make it better. If you're the Central African Republic, I think it's undeniable that the best government is not the government that governs least. And so the way I think of it more is that anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism in general is a kind of a theory of a special case, where it's sort of like Newtonian physics. It's completely correct within a certain envelope, and then just completely wrong outside that envelope. So the case for which anarcho-capitalism is sort of a proper definition of what a government should do, is basically, it's the right government for Utopia. It's the right government for Burning Man. It's the right government for a situation that's essentially an unstable equilibrium. An unstable equilibrium is a little like a pencil standing on its point. If you get the pencil to vertical, you're exerting very little force on it. Now imagine that the pencil is as tall as a telephone pole, and you're standing next to it on a big ladder. You can still hold that steady at top dead center with your hand. Anyone who's ever ridden a heavy motorcycle knows this. But if you drop the pencil or the telephone pole style pencil, you need a huge amount of force to pick it back up. And so, for that reason, anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism generally is an abstraction that doesn't really apply to any situation that we're going to find ourselves in anytime soon.
How can disengagement win the culture war? How can we return to the zeitgeist of the .com era as Peter Thiel describes it, where politics itself is passé?
I think, the only way to win the culture war is simply higher quality. Basically two things. And have fun, higher quality, and essentially an irony in a sense, because you're not actually, you're not actually winning a war. I mean, did the beatniks, win a war against the silent generation? No, they just existed and ignored them. The best way to do this is to exist, which means to basically subscribe to my Substack and also send lots of super chats to Michael here, to exist and to basically is to. What are Michael and I? We're basically the vanguard of the proletariat, as it were. We're the vanguard of the something. So in a way, basically, we're definitely the vanguard. And we're also grifters, and e-grifters to be exact. So in any case, to win the culture war, there you go. Is that alligator skin?
It's giraffe, baby. The fans paid for it.
Oh, hell yeah. Oh, I see. Wow, that's amazing. The internet is wonderful.
They paid for it out of spite. You know about my spite funding, right?
I think I heard something about that. It's brilliant.
So when people
do you want to make a pitch? Well,
I don't need to make the pitch because now is not the time for it. When people come at me on Twitter, I say it would be a shame if people send me money to waste just to spite you.
And
then that person is a revenue store. So here, I'll show you some things. This is made out of a walrus tusk. It's a pen stand. I don't need it. I have it. Here's a pen made with wood from the DMZ. Here's warthog tusk from South Africa. And this is something you would probably like, which is Fordite. What is Fordite? Fordite is in automobile plants. They keep painting cars back in the day and eventually made layers and layers, and they use that to make an artificial mineral.
That's beautiful.
And it's like a very Ayn Rand material.
But do you need it?
From a Corbett factory. No. Do I need 6 pens? When do I write anything? But I was paid for by spite. Is it grifting? Is it really grifting if there's no use for it to me whatsoever?
It's beautiful grifting. But in any case, you win just by being better. And you win by being better, and moreover, you win by appealing to something. If there's one sense, like, there's a lot of decline around us, to be honest. Yes. But there is also progress, and there's progress in ways that I think that most people don't recognize. And one of the forms of progress that we see is basically the increasing sophistication of media audiences. And so if you go back basically 100 years, one way to look at this is basically look at the sophistication of propaganda. You look at the propaganda from World War I. It's basically for like 9-year-olds. It's like the Hun is coming with his bayonet to rape your sister. Defeat the Hun, save America, right? Very basic stuff, and people are just like, they don't even ask any questions. They're like, who is this Hun? Why is he called the Hun? Yeah. They don't deconstruct anything. You go and watch some World War II propaganda. The one movie I always recommend is this movie that was directed by Don Siegel, who later did Dirty Harry.
I think it's Don.
Don Siegel, who later did Dirty Harry. And the script, actually, although he's not credited as such, is by Dr. Seuss. And this movie is from 1945. It's called Hitler Lives. It's 17 minutes long, and you have to watch it. It's cut from a longer film by Frank Capra called Our Job in Germany. It's unadulterated World War II propaganda. In it, you will learn that World War II, far from being a noble crusade to save the Jews, was actually a race war against the eternal German, who was going to invade us and basically, abolish Christianity, literally. And it's told in, it's basically World War II propaganda, and it's basically for 13-year-olds. Right? 13-year-olds would be like, yeah, I dig that, right? Anyone older would start to ask some questions about the eternal German and, what exactly, how is this a race war? And, but that's what people were thinking when they fought that war. It wasn't what the people who were running the war were thinking, of course. It was certainly not a crusade to save the Jews. No historian will tell you that it was a crusade to save the Jews, and nor was it especially good for the Jews.
Wait, can I interrupt one thing? There's this great book by Deborah Lipstadt called Beyond Belief. And what she talked about is because the World War I propaganda was so absurd and was later to be proven to be so false.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. I didn't know. I knew of Lipstadt, but I didn't know she had that theory. That's one of the reasons.
The entire book is about this. And she also, as Hitler is rising in power, and there was all these pogroms in Germany, everyone's like, "Oh, this is just bullshit propaganda. We went through this 20 years ago. You're lying."
Yeah. They poisoned the fucking well, and the way
ironically,
it's interesting. Well, also you've got to remember there's another reason why they can't use the Holocaust, which is actually happening as propaganda. It's a military secret, but it's of course, they find out about it. And there's this one amazing episode where a Polish Jew escapes from a concentration camp and he escapes from Auschwitz, I believe, literally. I forget the name of this amazing dude. He comes to America and he sees basically America's top Jew, arguably one of America's most important people, Felix Frankfurter, right? And he goes and tells the story to Felix Frankfurter, and he tells his story, obviously very vivid, obviously credible story, because it actually is true. And Felix Frankfurter's like, I can't believe you. And the guy's like, do you mean you don't believe me? Felix Frankfurter's like, no, I can't believe you. And that was because it was just not useful. And like, imagine if FDR comes out and is saying, well, we're fighting this war because, Hitler's gassing the Jews. Hitler's like, well, haven't I been telling you all along that this was a war for the Jews, right? You know, so it has, and then that has equal weight with, you know, the fucked up thing about poisoning the well. And if you look into how that well was poisoned, there's a book I can recommend called Falsehood in Wartime by Arthur Ponsonby. It was written by a Brit about these events, basically, you know, 10 years later. It's done in exactly the same way that it's done today. So it's not like there's some like Goebbels style like lie factory composing these lies about the Germans raping the Belgian nuns with their bayonets or whatever. It's that basically this information is passed through a chain of sources, each of which exaggerates it a little bit and also adds some credibility until it's basically gets into the hands of the, you know, Lord Bryce, you know, who's above reproach and, you know, the leading statesman of the whole world, right? You know, or the leading pundit of the whole world. It's even beyond pundit. And so basically these lies, which are later discovered to be lies, are sold to people as just absolutely true. You know, they just won't buy it. Like there's no use in selling this product, you know? And meanwhile, the other thing, Deborah Lipstadt probably doesn't talk about this. The other thing that's going on is on the German side, they're doing what people shouldn't do, which is they're basically inhabiting the stereotype. So basically, you know, the libs are like, oh, well, you know, this is what the German Hun behaves like, right? This is the behavior of the Hun. People listen to that and they're already in this world in which basically the libs are dominating the information discourse. And so they're like, okay, what's the opposite of a lib? Gosh, I know, you know, everybody knows, right? You know, and that information of what it means to be the opposite of a lib is communicated through sort of all of these channels. And so you basically take this kind of, you know, this Nazi attitude that develops, that people like Ernst Jünger, who's a German nationalist, write so eloquently about, you know, they sort of inhabit this kind of caricature of the blonde beast that kind of comes out of London during the war. Yeah. And so, you know, the results of this mendacity, of this kind of, you know, this is kind of the original sin of the Western media, because the media is really descended from this same kind of internationalist group who was, you know, like there's this sort of continuous thread of prestige running from then till now. And yeah, they were responsible, you know, they didn't obviously mean to cause the Holocaust. Yeah. But, you know, the other thing, of course, the worst thing about the Holocaust is you and I are descended from Yiddish speaking Jews, right? Not the fucking Yekkes, Yekke, right. You know that word? I'm from like Mises. Yekke is an old. I know this from books, not from my heritage. But Yekke is a Yiddish slur for German-speaking Jews. Oh no, hell no. No. Yeah, hell no. Yeah, not even once, right? You know, so basically Hitler is like, okay, I got a clever plan. I'm going to fend off the Allies who are run by the Jews, by holding these Yiddish-speaking Jews basically hostage. Well, you know, basically, you know, when you're like, you know, Arthur Sulzberger, and you're basically hearing that these, like, okay, technically related to you people, but in fact these like bug-infested jargon, literally the ghetto, these like
Yiddish was Ebonics for Jews.
Yiddish was Ebonics for Jews. They wouldn't even use the word Yiddish. You know, that's like Ebonics. They would say jargon, right? Yeah. So basically, like, and part of the whole like early settlement movement in New York City was basically rich Jews finding these people who are technically the same religion as them, but like not only are they disgusting and humiliating, but they're basically a reminder that Jews aren't really American. And so these people are like as assimilated as hell, like, you know, and so that suddenly they
outwasped the wasps.
They outwasped the wasps, and suddenly, you know, as did many Black Americans, and then suddenly they're like country cousins show up, right? You know, and they're just like, okay. Yeah, we kind of wanted these people to disappear anyway, right? You know, and so that's an additional reason for covering this up rather than publicizing it. So, you know, all of this is very, like, it's very gnarly history. There are no heroes in it. Everybody's a villain. There's certainly plenty of villains. You know, all of our ideologies are abundantly related to villains. You know, so that's just a, you know, that's the ugly reality.
What keeps pro-normie culture persisting in America to the extent it does? Well, that's an easy one.
No, he said pronomian. You know,
sorry.
Yeah, natural reading, but that's an old UR usage that failed to come, you know, to really catch on. Although it's totally legitimate from a Latin basis. Pronomian is basically supporting the law and believing in the law. So, you know, that's an excellent, you know, question. In some ways, the answer is, as you're seeing, is kind of nothing. In that you really. you had, of course, you have these sort of waves of disorder that rise in America, and they basically, it's sort of like the philosophy of the 60s, and I'm not even the late 60s of like hippies, but like the sort of the kind of the liberal ascendancy of the 50s and 60s creates a legal regime that results in what we all know now as the 70s. If you've ever seen the movie The Warriors, you might know something about the 70s. Yeah, yeah. Apparently there were a lot of interracial gangs, but you'll also see that in like Jackie Chan movies. I love it. Yeah, yeah. But so, what happens with those is that then you get this sort of, reaction of, Joe Schmo, of, Joe Sixpack, the sort of the deep normie reaction of like, holy shit, we got to stop this, and this is ridiculous. And they sort of go so far as you see this, in San Francisco, you have this sort of homeless camp problem there now. You also had this back in the early 80s under Art Agnos. You had Camp Agnos, where the whole Civic Center area became a sea of tents. Presumably they were kind of lower tech tents at that time. And they may even have had like the stakes and whatever, but that was followed by a reaction of what was left of the kind of Irish and Italian Reagan Democrat population of San Francisco. San Francisco, believe it or not, used to be, a huge center of like, there was like Tony Bennett, San Francisco, these like Irish and Italian, people. My daughter used to go to school in this school that was basically built out of part of some of the outbuildings of an old Irish Catholic church. All the time I was there, it was like a Shishi Mandarin immersion school. All the time I was there, I never heard anyone ask, what happened to the people that built this church? Where the fuck did they go? The church was actually burned out and full of junkies, and like, how is this giant, 4-story tall St. Joseph's church turned into this ruin? Where did these people go and why did they go? Right. If you're looking for sort of objective history, population migrations are kind of the first thing that you want to understand. So, that voter who would basically defend like law and order in California or pass like the 3 strikes law or whatever in California, that whole thing is very, very difficult to recreate. And the mistake that movement made was that it was basically focused on substantive results rather than on actual power. And so it was inevitably superficial. Now those voters are basically dying off. They're all dying of COVID, and nothing can bring their ballots back, besides some kind of really aggressive ballot harvesting. But
this is a really interesting question. I really want to hear your answer to this. Do you think there's any truth to the idea that psychedelics changed the culture in the late 1960s?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true. I think that it's really hard to like, come on, man, look at the Beatles, listen to the Beatles before and after drugs. I mean, that doesn't happen without drugs.
Have you ever met the elves?
The elves? No, I have actually never met the elves. You're really referring to a different time in my life. I'm 46 years old. I have a beautiful family, so out of respect for my family, there may be some areas that I won't go, but I will say that I've never met the elves. I don't know if I even really believe in the elves, to be honest. But the answer is yes.
What do you think is incompatible, or if there's anything compatible between absolute monarchy and anarchism's political philosophy?
Well, I think they're completely inconsistent. Rejecting the essence of government is legitimized coercion. And the thing is, the paradox of monarchy, it's like my analogy with the telephone pole earlier, is that the more order you have, the less need for force do you have.
Yes.
Law always, and the more force you have, the less need for violence you have. Yes. Force is the opposite of violence. These are not synonyms. And so the thing is, to get the telephone pole with the pencil point vertical, you're going to need to impose a lot of energy. Your goal the way in which anarchism is sort of, consistent with what does the telephone pole look like when it's standing upright, I think that there's a lot of room for various kinds of creative anarchism there. And, just the anarchism that we call capitalism was something that the Soviet Union could never do. Why could the Soviet Union never do it? It was too weak. And it was basically like, if we let people establish these little monarchies, what's going to happen, and they're going to take over the state. They're going to be completely out of control. They're going to be an independent focus of power. The Chinese solved that problem. They managed to basically hold their monarchy together while allowing this just insanely anarchic, capitalist, sort of wonderland. So in a sense, those things aren't consistent, but, the Chinese regime exists because it inherited, its power from this very monarchical fucking freakazoid Mao, right? And basically Mao establishes, the way that China became the most successful country of the late 20th century is that Mao establishes absolute power, and then it winds up in the hands of this guy Deng, who knows how to use it properly. The way Napoleonic France was built, and sort of many institutions of France were still built by Napoleon. The way Napoleonic France was built is that Robespierre basically plays the same role as Mao. He basically creates the absolute state that Napoleon inherits. So I'm kind of hoping that we don't have to go through this, here. There's this promising guy up in the Northwest, Raz Simone. Don't know if you've heard of him, but the warlock.
Big ups to Raz.
Hey, Raz, you're right there. Raz, you're right there. Yeah, I should deliver.
Raz, next year in Jerusalem.
My old co-founder was egging me on to go to the Chaz and deliver a speech, which would be wild, but maybe not prudent. I think I could do it if I was wearing. There's someone in the 90s or 80s built something that was called a bear-proof suit. It was literally like a bear-proof suit. So really the thing to do is to go into Chaz in the bear-proof suit.
I was going to give a talk at Charlottesville, and I had the outfit ready, which was fake leather pants, a shirt that said Super Gay, like the Superman logo. And I was going to give a talk on my favorite Drag Race contestants in no order, because I knew half the audience would get it and half of them would be ape shit, but there were no speakers that day. And I just had to spend a day with the lovely chaos. That is
well, you definitely lucked out.
I'm there. Adam says he's seeing an exponential increase in the cathedral's death throes. I don't know that if I'd agree with death throes. How and when do you see its final death playing out?
Wow, that's a really tough and difficult and interesting question. I don't think it dies. There are, of course, there are many ways for things to die. They can die violently. They can die sort of naturally and gently. I'm very into natural, gentle deaths. And so, the reality is that it's getting weirder and weirder and weirder. But actually, the only way it dies is if something actually kills it. There's no... and so the question is basically, what's the right way to think about that in a 21st century context? And the right way to think about that in a 21st century context looks a lot more like the fall of East Germany than the French Revolution. It looks like a context, it's like maybe take that distance and then go an extra 1.5x. So in a way, it's like, once you get to the point, I think there's a lot of people in the media that are basically starting to get to this sort of East German state of they would feel almost relieved if someone told them it was just, if someone just told them that it was over and they didn't have to go to jail. Fine, right. And so, in a way, if you're basically I think one of the really the answer is that it only ends with unconditional regime change. And the way that you sort of want to think of regime change is always it's sort of always this feeling of oh, it's just over. And if there's one really important principle about the really strong, successful regime changes, the Napoleons, the Augustuses, people like that, Ataturks, the one inviolable principle is that no one ever can be punished just for having loyally served the old regime.
Yeah.
And, but losing your job isn't a punishment. So, in a way, basically, and those are the kinds of terms like, there's sort of no possibility of like, America taking revenge against the professional mercantile class for having misruled it. I mean, it's a ridiculous concept. It's just like, basically like, you guys are great at ruling yourselves. I go to Burning Man and I don't have any ideas of how Burning Man should be differently governed. Yeah. You should not be in charge of people unlike you. That's really unhealthy. You guys need a break. You guys need a break. You just need a break. And in a way, that is the kind of proper spirit of regime change. And I think it's also the easiest spirit, by far the easiest spirit in which to actually accomplish it. But of course, anything can happen. I mean, it's fucking history.
Besides Rothbard, who do you like in the old right?
Oh, well,
that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge
John
Albert
T.
J.
Flynn?
John T. Flynn is great. I'm a huge Albert J. Nock fan.
Oh my God, he's the worst. He's the worst. I have.
How do you hate books? Have you read Memoirs of a Superfluous Man?
Oh my God, he's terrible. He's so
terrible.
First of all, he's terrible. First of all, his writings.
All right, now we're going to get into the beef section of the live stream. I'm going to need to pour myself some.
The fuck did you just call me?
Yeah.
I can do the hand thing.
Yeah.
I
you abhor Nock. Nock rubs you the wrong way. That's interesting. He's the sweetest old gentleman in the world.
He's also given up.
Yeah. Well,
and he's a Jeffersonian, and I'm a Hamiltonian.
Yeah, I've read his Jefferson. Have you read Frederick Scott Oliver's biography of Hamilton? Oliver was a Brit, actually. It's called Hamilton, an essay on American Union or something like that. Okay. It's about 100 years old, 120 years old, I think. And it's a deeply British imperialist appreciation of Hamilton as the great American statesman.
Yeah.
And of course, Hamilton was the real, leader of the Washington administration. He was our first monarch. Jefferson has his charms as well. I mean, these are all immensely charming. I mean, compare them to Trump and Biden. Come on, right? Who in 200 years is going to be a Bidenian?
Who in 200 days is going to be a Bidenian? He's going to be.
This is going to be a great election, man.
Did you see what happened today?
What happened today?
Had a video where he's talking about George Floyd, and he goes, black children have been asking for years, where's daddy? And I'm just like, holy shit. I pulled the clip and I put on Twitter. I'm like, guys, we have 5 months of this.
Yeah. I like the one where he did the speech about his plan to reopen America with the face mask dangling from around his ear. Geez. That was really good. Okay, yeah, sure. Nock has given up. Giving up was, in fact, in his time and place, I think the correct decision.
Sure.
We're in an age where I think it's very difficult to be optimistic, but it's still perhaps starting to be possible. But if you look at the record of false optimism throughout, the 20th century, I think that's a much more sort of distasteful taste. If you go and listen to, I mean, no offense to Charlie Kirk, he's a sweet boy with a very large head, but basically, like if you look at kind of Charlie Kirk, conservatives, I mean, the head size and brain size are correlated, and those correlate with IQ. I'll have not saying anything about the head to face ratio, but sorry. In any case, if you look at Charlie Kirk conservatism, there's this, kind of trope in conservatism where we're kind of always on the edge of victory and defeat. It's like, one more $10 super chat is going to push us, over the edge here, it's just like, it's a sort of it's very pornographic in its kind of stimulation of these political energies where you actually know that your $10 is going to do nothing at all but, buy another expensive latte in DC. It's just a grift. I mean, my grift is much more honest than this, I think.
Why don't you have a Patreon set up or something?
Well, I do now. I have a Substack. I mean, being a grifter is a serious task. You have to actually, work at it. other things in my life. And yeah, I also like the other thing about being a grifter is you kind of have to be a cult leader to a little bit of an extent. And I really hate that. I've always hated that. But obviously,
tanks in Harvard Yard when?
Mm.
I had that tweet. I go, does no one know how to show these morons where Harvard is? I go, tell them there's treasure in the walls, in every wall.
Yeah. I don't know that. I really hate to make numerical predictions, man. And that idea, that powerful meme, powerful meme. Well, sure. I mean, no, but possible is not. The thing is, ASAP is implies. Whenever you're doing something, you have to be ready for it.
Sure.
And so, in a way, like one of the sort of tragedies of 2016 is that it had this, it was sort of Russia's 1905 or whatever, where it had this quality of a premature and ineffective revolution that kind of, sort of achieved this amazing, unexpected success, and then had no idea what to do with it. There's a Civil War battle called the Battle of the Crater, in which Union soldiers spent many months digging a huge tunnel under Confederate lines, and then blew up this enormous mine and left this crater that was like 500 yards in diameter, this immense crater right in the middle of the Southern lines. And then basically the commander of the division that was supposed to go through it was like drunk. And, just a bunch of Union guys went into the crater and had no idea what to do and just got shot down like turkeys. But, the consensus is, they could have just walked right through those lines. Another example of this historically is the Battle of Bull Run. Reverse the sides. The Confederates win the Battle of Bull Run, first Battle of Bull Run, and they're like, oh, we showed those Yankees. We'll see next time they want to invade our independent nation. They could have been in D.C. in 24 hours.
And had the White House,
And had the White House. And the thing is, they were so focused on basically what they perceived to be kind of their narrative of the war, which was the establishment of independence, that in retrospect, it's obvious that they don't win until there are Confederate tanks in Boston, right? Yeah. You can see the Confederate tanks in Boston, I imagine, just picture them, and of course, no one in the Confederacy is thinking this way at all. And that means they're basically fighting to lose. And
so I guess they were the real conservatives.
They were the real conservatives. They were exactly like that. And one of the things, there's this great book by Sheldon somebody called The Glittering Illusion. And basically the Confederates, this may not interest anyone, but it might, and I think it has some relevance to kind of conservative strategy today. The Confederates had what was called the King Cotton theory of the war. The idea was that the Confederates' main export was, something called cotton. You probably have worn some of the stuff at the time. And most of this cotton is going to England, where it's feeding the mills of Manchester. And the mills of Manchester are basically run by a bunch of libs. That is basically the liberal Whig dissenter tradition in England. And, that so much of their power comes out of this industry. And so the Confederates are like, okay, we're going to declare independence. Number one, the English are always for rebels, so they'll be for us. Turns out the English are only for left-wing rebels.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of their first mistake. And their second mistake is, well, if the English don't do this voluntarily, here's what we're going to do. We're going to place an embargo on our own leading export. When we have no industry and no ability to build weapons for ourselves, we're going to embargo our own export as a form of diplomatic pressure. It's going to cause enormous pain among the libs in Manchester, and they're going to change their minds, and we're going to compel them to support us. This is possibly one of the stupidest military political decisions that has ever been taken in the history of the world. And basically, the Confederate ideology, even before the Civil War, is basically full of this idea of King Cotton. Right. And they're just like, we don't realize our power. We can cause a cotton. They're basically doing the equivalent of what OPEC did, in 1973. They're like,
This is like when the Republicans refused to fund Obamacare and thought, well, Obama is just going to come to the table and be like, okay, I guess we're not having Obamacare.
Yeah. Right. And so it's a spectacularly stupid, basically, decision because it actually denies them all of this. Like, if you don't do that, it's actually the union that's trying to cut off the cotton supplies. And the actual result of the cotton embargo is that in Britain, there's what's called the Cotton Famine. Huge numbers of people lose their jobs. Do they change their minds about anything? No. They lose their jobs and they get even more pissed off at the Confederacy. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Right. And then, of course, England is like, well, maybe we could grow some fucking cotton in fucking Egypt.
Yeah, yeah.
How about fucking India? And so by like 1863, like the price of cotton is crashing again. And the whole thing is completely, your fucking cotton OPEC, plan is just in ruins. And it was just a tremendous fuck up. And, conservatives do that kind of thing all the fucking time.
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course. Are you familiar with Princes of Yen and It Mirrors Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley? I'm not familiar with any of this.
I'm absolutely not familiar with it at all, but it certainly sounds interesting, and I'll check it out. Is that I imagine it's probably sounds like it's about post-war Japan, or maybe it's relationship to like the Manchurian occupation government in pre-war Japan. There's a lot of connections there.
If the free market can't do it, how do we prevent the aftermaths of the cathedral's death from being worse?
Well, the thing is, whatever kills the cathedral is going to have to basically take charge of that situation.
Yes, yeah.
So
it's circulation of the elites. That's what the Italians.
You're not leaving. You can't have a. I mean, if you have a regime change that leaves a vacuum of power, that's not the fall of East Germany. That's the fall of Libya.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that.
Monarchy starts today. Pick your king.
Is it
BAP? It's BAP, isn't it?
I think I would pick someone who had a great deal of very dynamic management experience. And because what you really need. Okay, fine. I'll pick a king. Are you ready for this?
Yeah.
Gordon Ramsay.
Oh, come on! It's not possible.
Imagine, it's like if you've watched Kitchen Nightmares, imagine like Gordon Ramsay like going to the State Department. He's like, okay, let's have a look at what's in the State Department's fridge, right? He starts like pulling out these files. He's like, you're funding this guy? Like, what the fuck are you trying to accomplish here? Like, why is this guy in the building? I mean, and that's in a way the spirit. The spirit of Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, the British version is better. But the spirit of it is basically you're coming into this space which basically has this kind of distorted bubble of reality, which it thinks is functional. And Gordon comes in and he's just like, you're out in fucking space. You think you're operating in reality, but in fact, you're serving stale ham and moldy potatoes.
Yeah, yeah.
And, let's get a nice fresh menu in here. It's always the same basic kind of formula every time, and let's get a nice fresh menu in here and really transform the place. And we're going to leave you like thanking us profusely when we leave after a week. Napoleon does something like this in Malta. Napoleon, one of the most famous on a kind of, sort of episodes in regime change is Napoleon's occupation of Malta, because he takes over, Malta, which has been run by the Knights Hospitallers or the Templars or some other fucking grand order, right? In this incredibly medieval way, literally reorganizes the government of Malta into a modern European republic in a week, and then leaves the island and kicks the fucking shit out of the Austrians, right? And I mean, yeah, that's the sort of thing that kind of any great turnaround specialist can do, but they actually have to be in control of Malta. They can't be like a consultant basically brought on by the Knights Hospitallers, right? And I mean, the Knights Hospitallers have to be gone, and otherwise it's just a joke. And that's normally what happens when you take people with corporate experience to DC.
Would you prefer to shred or burn the 3x5 card of allowable opinion?
I don't really care. I can let the card remain as a historical document.
That's a good one.
We'll frame it. We'll put it next to the Constitution. We'll say that after that, this was the real Constitution. It was replaced by this index card, and you'll have this kind of sequence of documents where you go like the Instrument of Government, the Restoration, the Dominion of New England, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution. The Constitution is revised in 1861. The Constitution is revised in 1933, and then there'll just be this little index card. That's the index card. This is Black Lives Matter with a capital B.
Hashtag Black Lives Matter.
It's a hashtag. Thank you.
Who is more to blame for our current predicament? Wilson and the social gospel, or the French postmodernists of the 60s and 70s?
Definitely Wilson and the social gospel.
Of course. Okay, thank you. That was a gimme.
Yeah. Give me a hard one.
We got one from Greg. This one is okay. Is it fair to say? Hold on a second. These super chats are annoying. The screen's getting away from me. Hold on. Here's one. Owners with more private property hold more power in the voluntary community and are de facto monarchs. This seems completely coherent with the absolute monarchy idea.
Sure. Well, I mean, Aristotle will tell you about, all kinds of analogs of monarchy, some of which are politically incorrect. But you see, the principle of kind of authority and ownership, which is sort of, you see that principle in everywhere that's functional. So, there are probably many examples that I haven't even thought of. I mean,
okay, let's see. We got one right here. Is it fair to say, under your model of monarchy, that the monarch can execute any member of its state coercively? This model will lead to the current governance structure. Democracy is the rhetorical tool that enables monarchs to manage the plebs.
Ooh, that sounds like two or three. I'll have to answer the first part of that, separately. Of course, basically anything that's undivided power means that the state has that power, because there's nothing else. There's nothing. Oh, this is good because it's a $50 question, so I'll throw $50 of time at it.
And wait, there's a $10 follow-up.
Oh Jesus! Hang on, I missed. Okay, yeah.
Well, 50 Canadian, so this is only $2.
I make that joke with my wife all the time.
It's a loon.
It's a loon. All right. For $13.57, that's a very astute sort of several steps forward. I feel like, actually you're condensing a much longer argument into something, very, very short. I think the answer is that in the present world, one of the things that we have, one of the advantages that any kind of monarchical system of government has that I don't think most people recognize, is that the level of energy in the population is very, very low and very, very weak.
Yes.
And so you actually don't see like French Revolution style stuff happening. There's, the occupied zone in Seattle. Anyone who's sort of worried that basically the occupied zone in Seattle is going to turn into the Paris Commune, really should... I know. Really should go and, but not even that. They should go and read about the Seattle General Strike. And that was, I think, about 100 years ago, and that involved a serious attempt to create a Soviet republic in Seattle with the Seattle working men, as they said at this time, and it was smashed by Mayor Ole Hansen, this crazy Norwegian, with the American Legion. And if you don't know what the American Legion was, it was kind of an American kind of SA or something like that. There's this famous incident called the Centralia Massacre, where they had a pitched battle with the industrial workers of the world, killing in like Centralia, Washington, which is like this peaceful hippie town now, killing like 20 people. I mean, it's just like, if you think, what's going on now is kind of epic by modern standards, but like, it's not really epic by historical standards. Whereas the Seattle General Strike was pretty epic, but it was also kind of a joke compared to the Russian Revolution or the Paris Commune, right? So, you're really, you're looking at, let's face it, Marx was a great writer, and his greatest line really is that history repeats itself twice, first as tragedy and then as farce. And the idea that we're seeing, we're definitely seeing it repeat as farce, and sort of farce in power is kind of actually one of your stronger leading indicators of regimes not doing too well, because you can't really have power and be a joke. The Jazz is definitely kind of a joke, but so is Occupy Wall Street, right? And that kind of got a lot of the same, tongue baths.
So here's the question I had that I know you don't.
Wait. We got to get back to the $13.57 cents question. So the question is basically, democracy is the rhetorical tool that enables monarchs to manage the plebs. I actually just don't think it's that hard to manage the plebs these days. I think it's actually really super easy. Now it's super easy because the plebs have sort of been so brutalized, really. I mean, sort of spiritually brutalized, demoralized is the right word, kind of more in the 19th century, the sense of the word demoralized, have literally lost their morals. But when you have a very low supply of virtue among the plebs, yeah, governance is the
Hey, you know he's French Canadian because instead of saying through the roof, he says through the chart.
through the chart.
My
Yes,
autism is through the chart.
your garbage Canadian currency is wonderful. Let's continue with the answer there. So essentially, here is this is such a good question that I've actually thought through this in sort of considerable detail. The short-term answer is that just because the populace is so sort of demoralized, and especially, not only is it demoralized, it's very nonviolent historically. I mean, even these riots are nothing, right? And
Yeah, of course,
it's very nonviolent. I mean, can you imagine? You're like, okay, let's disband the State Department. Next morning you have all these like diplomats in striped pants, like they don't really wear striped pants, but setting up like barricades in Foggy Bottom, like they're like piling the cobblestones. Cops who come in are just savagely killed and hung from the lampposts. No, I don't really see it.
Right.
Knowing the Foreign Service, right? And if it was like a squash game, maybe, right? And so actually, what you'll find is that a modern Western country is extremely easy to rule. That changes as the population becomes more virtuous. As you basically succeed, sort of health starts to return to the populace, and they're basically like, oh yeah, who is this old fart, who's in charge of us now? Yeah, I saw all those videos from like 2020 of like burning cars in the street. I can't relate to it. I can't believe, we should have freedom and democracy. It doesn't lead to burning cars. That's ridiculous. Yeah. Come on, let's be. So, you see this, you do sort of see this coming back after a relatively long period of time. And essentially that becomes, a problem that you can't like, you can't sort of pre-plan for that. I think the best way to if you look at very successful monarchical regimes, you look at Augustus, you look at Elizabeth I, you even look at frickin' Putin or Xi Jinping. These regimes are perceived by their subjects as very successful. They are, in fact, generally successful. And when you're actually doing well, turning that into being popular or sort of at least being popular enough to like not result in bloody street riots is great. Secondly, the technology of social control, like it or not, is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And so it becomes basically, just from a sort of physical military perspective, the military value of, a human being with like a rock in his hand is going down and down and down. And so that's just a military reality, which tends to make the state stronger against violent overthrow. Sorry. Okay. So I think that's a reasonably complete, answer.
Here's a question I don't know how you're going to answer because there's two ways to look at it. Okay. Elon Musk tweeted out, "Take the red pill," which I'm sure you enjoyed to some extent. It
was definitely amusing. Yes.
Yeah. And then the not so amusing part was when Ivanka Trump opens up her whore mouth and says, "I already did." Hold on. So the question is Ivanka Trump red pilled? And you could say, if someone is working at the corridors of power at that level, they are inevitably red pilled.
Well, I would say that I don't know if I would call Ivanka Trump being really in the corridors of power. I think the corridors of power are permanent, and I think Ivanka Trump is temporary.
Okay, that's true.
And so it's certainly the corridors of fame. She gets to be on TV and have I don't think that there's sort of been any really substantial contact with sort of real power there. As for the red pill, of course, it's gotten, the brand has, it got, It got, let me use the word borrowed. It got, just as I borrowed it from the Wachowskis, it got borrowed from me. You know, interestingly, it got borrowed by the Nazis and the PUAs at roughly the same time.
Yeah.
Which, you know, it's like, well, neither of them would have borrowed it from the other, really. Like, and then, of course, so I mean, it's too good a metaphor for it to mean anything really anymore. It's just like this, you know, very abstract symbol of like, I dissent. But in terms of, you know, there are millions of like bad and ineffective ways to dissent, you know, to everyone that actually works.
Let's see how many of these questions we could do quickly, because we're running behind. What do you like best about me?
Definitely the hair.
Okay. Let's go. We got this one. It's caught up. Have you read any Nassim Taleb, and what do you think of him?
Gosh, I read his first book. I think he, you know, he repeats himself a lot, like a lot of smart, you know, people. He's a very, you know, wasn't it the hedgehog who has one big idea? He's very much a hedgehog, you know, type thinker. I seem to recall he's been pretty right on about COVID. He has, you know, a number of, you know, strange ideas. He's, you know, has this anti-IQ and anti-GMO, you know, bone to pick. I think he's a very sort of, I mean, he's a sort. There should be 1,000 people like Nassim Taleb. He's not perfect. He's very, very smart. He's very egocentric. You know, he's just a classic, you know, intellectual. And when he's wrong, man, he sure is wrong. You know, Arthur Herman. Gosh, I'm pretty sure I've read something by Herman. He's sort of a solid, kind of almost on the edge between neocon and paleocon, but I can't remember what book. But I sort of remember having a generally favorable.
Yeah, he was on the stream last before you. He's amazing. He wrote the idea of decline in Western history, which is superb, and the Cave of the Light, which is about Plato versus Aristotle throughout history. How did your strange early life affect your worldview? I didn't know you had a strange early life.
I was a foreign service brat.
Oh, okay.
I was also a gifted child, so I wound up being in strange places. You know, 3 grades out of place, which was definitely a little bit strange. You know, I think you basically. You know, the less it was definitely an autistic kind of way to grow up, even though I'm not super autistic. I mean, I'm a little autistic. But
where's the Maury Povich gif?
We got
back the lie detector tests. Oh, it exploded. You broke the machine. It's off the chart.
I think that you know, it's that, you know, sort of inhabiting the present as if it were a foreign country, and basically looking at, you know, you're sort of like, as a student of history, you always want to ask the question, you know, how are people 100 years from now going to see this period? Because unless, you know, shit is totally reduced to ruins, like they're gonna see this period, and you know, maybe they'll see it as a period that, despite its good intentions, was still, you know, extremely racist. And you know, I mean, there's a lot farther you can go in that direction. I mean, a lot farther. But you know, or maybe something will have changed. But the thing is, you want it. You know, even if things are still crazy in 2120, maybe they won't be crazy in 2520. And eventually you'll come to this point where there's a lot of, I think it's a fairly accurate statement to say that certainly when you get back to history before, say, 1600 or whenever, for most periods, we understand, just modern academic historians understand those periods generally better than the people who lived in them. In fact, generally better than anyone who lived in them. And so, you know, if you can achieve that level of understanding, you know, then you're really, you sort of feel very comfortable even in this sort of alien world where things are really.
Let's go another 15 minutes. Is that cool? So be an even 2 hours. Is that cool?
All right. Cool. Let's do it.
Thoughts on what you think are the biggest division in your country, in the country, rural versus urban? I don't think that's true at all. I think it's the college educated versus the masses. Yeah,
but those things are becoming, you know,
self-segregating.
Those things are certainly related. Well, you know, I basically I fled COVID, so I'm kind of in not really rural, but kind of deep. You know, well, there's farm animals around here, and it's certainly Trump country, and you know, and I certainly leave.
Oh shit! You saw Noose? This is MAGA country.
Yeah, no, yeah.
These Nigerians had these nooses.
Actually, you know, because of my Jewish ancestry, they actually mistook me for a black man. They were going to hang me. You know, You laugh, but actually, I'm only half Jewish, but my father is really a very Jewy-looking Jew, and not only is he's Ashkenazi, but he's Sephardic-looking, which is really strange. And his main and also in his youth, he had this amazing like Abby Hoffman Jewfro, in addition to kind of looking like a cross between Muammar al-Gaddafi and Ralph Nader, right? So and his real racial claim to fame though is that once when he was U.S. foreign servicer in Nigeria, he was mistaken by a Nigerian for a Nigerian.
It's like Michael Jackson said, it's called colored people because we come in every color. He said this, the bard.
I love Michael. So sad about Michael Jackson. But yeah, that's to get back to the original question, the answer is certainly.
Do you think the present turmoil is organic, or is it induced by something like Soviet-style active measures? Like I think he's asking about Soros.
Yeah, there's this great YouTube piece with Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB agent, where he's like, basically, it's a fun piece, but the fact is Bezmenov is basically taking credit for the sun going up, and you can see that by the fact that the sun keeps going up even after the rooster dies, right? And so I'd warn people against reading too much into that. The reality is that the amount of funding available for generally left-wing community organizing and activism is enormous. For example, there's a sort of whole kind of money laundering, system where you can do, if you're a super rich progressive individual, which basically means a super rich individual minus a few people, you can donate to these organizations through what's called a donor-directed fund, and the major one of these is called the Tides Foundation. The Tides Foundation processes about $500 million a year. It's basically, I think the Tides Foundation is probably spending roughly as much as just by itself, spending roughly as much as all conservative foundations combined. And so, the paths by which those reach, Mr. Antifa black-clad dude on the street are various and winding. And I think certainly a lot of these organizations, which are, don't get me wrong, composed of very sincere people, actually they do operate on a shoestring, but nonetheless, there's a lot of them. And yeah, there's money out there for organizers and activists. What you'll generally see, I think, is that these people aren't paid to riot. They're paid to basically be professional progressives, and that allows them to, basically have fun with the Antifa thing in their free time. And there's certainly a lot of professional progressives in America.
What do you think of normie reactions to things like BAP?
I think that the sort of the generation of, BAP, and you say things like BAP, that's a really weird thing to say. Okay, sure. Like there's nothing like BAP. There's no one like BAP. There are followers of BAP. There are imitators of BAP, but there's nothing like BAP. Okay, let's be totally clear on that. And the genius of that is essentially that BAP is practicing. His understanding of how to relate to the public is, I think, very, very strong and very, very different from mine in that he's sort of conducting this, I hesitate to use the word, irony, because then I run into BAP's words that, what is this irony? I don't understand this gay thing called irony, which is, of course, is a very ironic thing to say. And the sort of the like genius of saying, not like, you're going to have to come to me. You're going to have to understand my esoteric doctrine. You're going to have no way of telling when I say something, whether I mean it literally or metaphorically or kind of what I even think on this level. I am not going to attempt to engage you in like sincere politics at all. I am going to basically engage your imagination and your sense of beauty and your sense of wonder. My God, that's so much better than fucking all the works of fucking William F. fucking Buckley. I can't even tell you.
That's not saying much. Here's an easy one. Why do I think anarchy is more preferable to monarchy? I think that's for me, though. I think the transition is going to be a lot easier, and I think it's a lot more dynamic. But we're here for Moldbug, not for me. So let's get to the other Moldbug questions. I appreciate your stand. This is very, very nice. I don't know what Centralia is. I don't.
The Centralia Massacre that I mentioned earlier. The fight between the this is a very interesting question. I'm not even sure it's a question. It seems more like a statement.
So here's one: Are the helicopters going to be hipster Hueys or rad Blackhawks?
I'm not really a helicopter. I'm not a helicopter
expert. Did you see the picture
expert.
of me and Hans Hermann Hoppe? I gave him a toy helicopter.
I did not, but you know, I really like you know, someday if Hans Hermann, you know, if you're listening, you know, I can probably come to your property and freedom thing, and I would love to do that sometime.
Okay, I'll get you in touch. It's easy. Yeah.
No, I think I have his email somewhere actually, but you know, nice to be reintroduced because he's you know, Hans Hermann is the guy who basically broke me out of Rothbardian libertarianism because he basically, because he, you know, he's of course a leader in that school, and then he writes, you know, this work, Democracy, the God That Failed, that kind of extends sort of extends that way of thinking toward this domain where you're like, okay, I can see how you can go from being a libertarian, which is nominally this is supposed to be very opposed to the Ancien regime, to being like, okay, now I actually understand the Ancien regime. So it's a sort of break into this. It's really the door out of Plato's cave. And so I'm really indebted to him for that.
Greg wants to give you money to do private conversation groups. Would you be down?
Well, you know, given that Greg seems to be a very generous person, I'd certainly think about it. You know, as I'm a family man, my children need their gruel. Yeah, Michael, I'm happy to talk to fans. You know, one of the things that basically my style, you know, results in is that I basically don't get hate mail. You know, this might surprise, you know, some people, but, you know, actually, I'll bet Charlie Kirk gets a lot of fucking hate mail.
Oh, for sure. And memes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a different kind of hate mail, but I mean, I bet he gets hate mail from the left, actually. You know? I'm familiar with the memes.
Michael, as a hipster and Moldbug as creator of the terms, how do you really feel about the popularization of the red pill? I'm more excited about the popularization of the cathedral. Red pill is going to be a term that's going to be degenerate very shortly. Cathedral is one that still has some utility in the near future. And as a hipster, I'm always trying to innovate and create new jargon.
I think that's a fair outcome. I just, you know, it's like, how do I feel about the popularization of anything? I mean, the mob is this, you know, the bigger the mob, I mean, it's this like wild force, you know, it's like whenever you feel the power of the mob approaching, it's like a wave. And, you know, if something becomes more popular than it should be, it's like the feeling you have of being on a surfboard and, you know, having a wave come that's just too big for your skill level. Which in my case is very low. You know, you're just like, holy fuck, but you're like, it's too late, you're on the wave, you know?
If we were to compare the status quo to Warhammer 40k faction, would they be the Imperium or the Chaos? Keep that nerd shit off of my stream. I have no fucking idea. You have any?
All right, I don't know. I've seen the Warhammer 40k memes. I like the art looks good.
Oh, come on.
These
people should not. No. Do not explain it. Do not explain it, sir. Yeah, okay. We got one here. Curtis, has anyone told you bear a striking resemblance to Dylan Moran?
I have no idea who Dylan Moran is.
I have no idea who that is either.
When I will say that when I was 20 years younger, I look more like Keanu, but you know, we all fall apart with age. Except you, Michael. You're aging really gracefully, which is amazing.
I've got the cheekbones back in. They're looking good.
Yeah.
Can you have monarchy without state religion?
Oh, these questions are so good, man. You're getting.
I told you it was going to have good people.
So it's a really solid question. I think the answer. I'm actually not sure. I'll just go with a not sure.
Yeah. I
think it remains to be seen. I think the experiment might be unwise, but maybe.
In a million possible worlds, how many worlds exist where the cathedral is left wing? Ooh.
A million. The cathedral is basically the ideological structure of the system is, you know, the ideology of the system is a result of its structure. It's basically the ideology that succeeds in kind of a Darwinian sense in an oligarchy like the one we have. Actually, in system software, there's an analog to this. It's called Conway's Law. Conway's Law says that the structure of any software system is a function of the structure of the organization used to build it. And again, you're seeing basically the same thing. So sort of, you know, what leftism selects for is it sort of selects for this desire for power without responsibility. And when you have power without responsibility is the very definition of an oligarchy. Those things are just natural correlates. The problem is not, and to me, this is a very optimistic thought, because it says the problem is not changing the minds of this huge number of people. The problem is just that the structure is wrong. And if the structure is right, these people will just change their minds.
Exactly.
They do it all the fucking time.
Yeah. This is a great one. Do you think Q is a bunch of not smart individuals being trolled, or is it a psyop to misdirect populist right energy? That's a great question.
The former. You don't have anyone capable of psyops of that level.
The question I missed before was, who do you think is going to win November, and do you think we're going to lose the gains of red pilling we've gotten in the last 3 years?
I'm just going to come out, right here, and endorse Joseph R. Biden for the presidency.
I gave him money.
States. Partly this is dictated by the fact that only one of these presidential candidates has actually kissed my mother, so I have a kind of a family obligation here. I'm not making that up.
Biden may have kissed her, but Trump raped her. So
I think she would have told me about that. I think she would have mentioned that. She was quite.
She had an NDA.
Yeah, she.
He always makes his rape victims sign NDAs.
No, my stepfather actually used to work for Biden, but so I have a family obligation to endorse Biden. But in family comes first here. Secondly, I think that a Biden victory is probable as well as preferred. Even despite his advanced age. And I mean, Trump's no spring chicken either.
Sure.
But I think that if anything, it's interesting. The last 3 years have really they may have red pilled some, but they've blue pilled the fuck out of a lot of people. And I think in some ways, you see it look at how much ideological energy people have gotten just in the last week, right? Trump, what is he, doubled the revenues of the New York Times. Even before this, he brought the revenues of the ACLU up 10x. There's a little fact about DC that most people don't know, which is that every nonprofit organization in DC in an election year prepares 2 budgets. There's one budget for if their guy wins, or obviously they'll have a side. There's one budget for if their side wins and one budget for if their side loses. Which budget do you think is larger?
Right.
It's the budget they have a larger budget if their side loses. So that's a natural kind of stabilizing pendulum, factor. So the thing is that what you have right now, I think, Biden will be a great red pill, because what happens right now is that someone who's sort of young, and like most people really think Trump is in power. They use that term all the time. It's a linguistic confusion. Trump is in power. So you can sort of resist him. And enormous energy has been, sort of created, resisting the Trump regime, which is only slightly more real than the Elizabeth II regime. Right. So you have all of this energy basically, and then, you elect someone who is a very sweet old gentleman, but not perhaps the most exciting and inspiring individual in the world, and you have nothing to fight. So you have all of this energy built up and nothing to fight, and sort of no enemy to beat. So there's sort of 2 hypotheses as to what happens there. One is that they basically, turn all of that energy into going even more full KGB than they've gone before. I don't think that the level of vitality is needed to do that. I think that you end up just basically with a bunch of people feeling like they just spent the last month high on crack and now they're like detoxing in jail. And so it's going to be a very intense, depressing experience of like, what do we, how do we do anything now? What do we care about? What do we, and so you're kind of pulling the chair in a sense. And so you're basically, in a way, you're showing that this whole experience, like it feels unfulfilling. It resulted in like, just more of the same in this boring, corrupt DNC, rule, and the police are not actually being abolished, and all of America is not actually being turned into Chaz. And it's very deflating. And so, obviously, if you're thinking tactically, do you want to inflate your enemies or do you want to deflate them? Well, yeah, then you should be losing the elections, not winning them. In fact, you shouldn't even be participating in them because they're joke elections because they don't actually give you any power. So yeah, that's why I want to see Trump lose.
I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all the questions. Thank you for being so generous with your time. What I want you to do is whenever you drop new stuff on that site, just message me so I can tweet it out.
I will do that.
Because I know a lot of people in my audience, including myself, are obviously big fans of yours, and you've been very influential in my work. And I'm glad that you don't think I'm raising your baby all fucked up.
Indeed. Well, there's one way, if I can repeat my brand, there's one sure way to always get updates from graymirror.substack.com, which is...
I'm going to put this on the screen right now. So that'll be the last thing people see when they watch this video.
Perfect. And you can even...
Hold on a second. Go ahead. Keep talking. Sorry.
You can even subscribe for free. My latest piece was free. My next probably one or two will be free. You'll get the podcast as well. And I think if you have the free subscription, you'll be notified when premium posts are available, just to make you jealous. It's all about the grift, man. All right. Well, that was Michael. That was some great grifting. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And let's do this again sometime.
When are you any plans to be in New York?
No such plans at present. I'm not traveling due to COVID, and I have a high-risk person in my family, so that's probably going to be true for a while. But I'd love to come in there.
Anytime. Open door. Talk soon, my friend.
All right. Take care, man.
All right. All right, guys. I'm really sorry I didn't get to all those questions. I don't know what to do. This was the first time this has happened. I'm sorry. I don't have any good to say. It's annoying. I will talk to you all soon. Hope you enjoyed this. This went longer than I expected, but he's the best. I'm a huge fan of Curtis's. As obviously, as you know, if you've read The New Right, I credit him enormously in that book. I will see you all on Nightshade tomorrow, and you're welcome on Tuesday with Dave Smith. Talk soon, everybody, and apologies again.